Welcome everyone to the very first Victorian Chapter Lunchbox Chat. We're really pleased to start bringing these events to you. My name's Julie Downey. I'm part of the Victorian Committee. I'm also on the board of the National Road Freighters Association, and I'm a veteran truck driver of some 24 years, just about now. We do plan to have these events every 2 months, so keep your eye out. We're hoping if you've got any suggestions for topics that you might like for us to discuss, then certainly get in touch with the committee. I'd like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the First Nations of Australia, who continue to be the sovereign custodians of their countries and the sovereignty of the Maori in New Zealand. We acknowledge the ongoing traditional custodians of the lands on which we live, work and learn, and pay our respects to elders who have passed on the legacy and knowledge and culture to the future generations. May this sharing of knowledge through Mataranga, Maori and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of knowing, being and doing guide you with wisdom and courage as it enhances our collective futures. Now, the running order for today's event has been a little bit difficult. Unfortunately, I'm not the boss of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister has requested Senator Sterle to speak at another event that came in the last 24, 36 hours. So he still will be here, but not until after past, probably closer to 12:40. So we've changed the order of speaking around, and we'll be having Stuart Newstead first up, and then Jerome Carslake, and then finishing off with Senator Sterle. As we go through, we'd really love to see your questions popped into the chat box, and then we'll be going through those questions and getting everyone to ask those questions and answer those questions and speak to those questions towards the end. So first up, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about my story and why this topic's so important. As a truck driver, we're always, or nearly always, getting the raw end of the deal. In 2016, I had a semi-trailer that I was operating for a farmer, and I was given an inconceivable task. I was basically told there was a load and then mucked around for nearly 15 hours and then expected to go interstate to deliver that load on an express basis, no stopping. I got extremely fatigued. I pulled up and I went to bed. That cost me my job. The company we were working for wanted me out of the business. The farmer stood by me and said, you keep the truck, you find the work, and as long as you can make that truck pay, you can keep that truck running. So that's what I did. Unfortunately, there's no minimum standards in this industry, and as a result, one of the companies that I was carting the freight for were very slow to pay, and it went 60 days, 90 days, 120 days. It actually went out to 6 months, and it got to the point where we had to load the truck, leave the freight on the truck, take the truck home, and basically hold the freight hostage, which is not something that anybody ever wants to be put in a position to do. Had they paid on time, I still would have been doing that job. At that same time, personally, my daughter had my little granddaughter. As a result of not being able to keep that truck profitable, I had to go and chase the grain harvest, and I missed my daughter's first year of life. So that's just to give you a bit of an understanding of how the industry impacts on people's families. And with that, unfortunately, the very sad news has come through that there has now been, as of today, 1,300 people die as a result of or since the fall of the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal and the previous government's inability to replace it with anything better. With that, I'd like to hand over, please, to Stuart Newstead to present.
Thanks, Julie. And I think your anecdote actually sets the scene well for some of the issues we hear around casualisation of the workforce and what has essentially become the gig economy. I thought I'd just offer a few thoughts as conversation starters. So hopefully this will be an interactive session where people put up their thoughts and discuss their experiences and any research evidence, etc., they have around this. But I thought I'd put up a few thoughts around some research that's been done at MUARC and how it might relate to this topic. If we could go to full screen on this, that would be good. Thank you. So just go to the next slide, please. So I think one of the interesting ways in which workplace safety and organisational culture has been studied in recent times is through the application of Rasmussen's risk management framework. And really that talks about how safety permeates from the top level of government policy setting down through regulations into company and management practice, and how it ultimately affects staff and the exposure to hazardous processes. And it also talks about the feedback mechanism that needs to exist in that process to actually improve safety dynamically. And the picture you see here sort of illustrates that process as a two-way street. And this is a demonstration of this actually put together by Gavin Linton, who's an adjunct at MUARC and studied this quite carefully. What it says, though, if you want to integrate safety through your organisation, you have to have these mechanisms of feed down and feedback for that safety culture to be able to grow and become effective. And I think what Julie's story shows, and what we know generally about the gig economy, is that if you're breaking that chain, you have a problem. And the gig economy particularly actually breaks that chain between the management and the staff. And so what you find is you don't have the company culture and safety and the controls that are put in for a normal staff member that are necessarily overlaid on those people who are working as contractors, subcontractors to the system. And I think that's a real concern, because it limits the ability to apply that learning and those processes to improving safety through the system. So I think it's an interesting way to think about how this process may be either put back together through trying to limit the gig economy as a means of employment, or about how that could potentially be extended to overlay the requirements for safety to flow beyond the organisation and its own staff to the associates of other organisations which may work as contractors to that staff as well. And I know some organisations actually have that, some policies in place to do that, but I don't think it's really well established how you do that effectively to make sure that everyone you're associating with in that space has that safety culture and requirement to improve what we do. I actually spoke to our former director, Klaus Tingvall, recently from Sweden, and he talked about one of the developments in Sweden is to think about with some of these big operators as to identify what he calls a safety footprint. And that safety footprint is not about necessarily just what we see in that Rasmussen's framework, but extends to all elements which that company might touch. And I think thinking more broadly about what a company's safety footprint and trying to build it into these management structures is actually an interesting way of thinking about how we might improve safety in this essentially fractured workplace that we have in place now. So there's some initial thoughts on that organisational structure and how we might fit that into what we're talking about today. So next slide, please. One of the observations that's been made, particularly about the heavy vehicle fleet, and which is we're talking about in the context today, is that it is an ageing fleet. This is some material that Peter Hart presented in an industry magazine some years ago now, showing how there's a consistent trend to ageing infrastructure in the heavy vehicle space. And that trend hasn't stopped. The current ABS figures show that our heavy vehicle fleet is now on average 14 years old, but importantly too, many of those vehicles exist in service on Australian roads up to about 35 years of age. Now, what we'd be hoping, as we see in the light vehicle fleet, that the bulk of the exposure is actually taken by the newer vehicles owned by the bigger operators who have that safety culture in place. Well, what I think the gig economy and subcontracting through the to people like Julie, as she talked about, is that it will have an impact on that infrastructure being used for a lot longer, and a lot of the freight tasks being actually pushed down to that older infrastructure. Now, if we go to the next slide. Recent MUARC work has shown that will have an impact, particularly for the occupants of those vehicles that are being pressed into service for longer and longer. And obviously, as Julie talked about, if you're subcontracting at the bottom of the food chain, you don't have the opportunity to upgrade that vehicle. You've really got to make that infrastructure work for you and earn for you as long as possible. Excuse me. But what we see here is, again, as we see in the light vehicle fleet, we need our newest heavy vehicles to be burdening the majority of the freight task, so we can capitalise on those safety improvements that we've seen over time. And it's not only occupant protection we're talking about. A lot of the newer heavy vehicle fleet also has assistance technology in it to assist with crash avoidance. And they include things like AEB, lane keep assist, fatigue monitoring, vision technology. All those things are going to help improve the safety of our heavy vehicle fleet. But we have to make sure that fleet is turning over and the newest, safest vehicles are being used in preference to some of the older vehicles. And I think the gig economy model, as Julie has talked about, is really preventing that from being optimised in terms of the infrastructure we have available. Next slide, please. I think the other concern that we have is also on driver experience and competency in this area too. Now, recently, MUARC has been doing some work around licensing-related factors and how they overlay on risk of crash involvement of heavy vehicle drivers. And there's a couple of key things that come up and as key risk factors. The first one is driving experience. So giving heavy vehicle licenses to people with less experience, so probationary license, or those who've been in the industry for a very short time, can be very problematic. And the question is, if we're going to this sort of gig economy, what does that do for allowing that experience to be developed and monitored? Who is driving the truck that you're subcontracting this work to, and what is their risk profile? The other notion that's come up in our work recently are the risk that people who have very bad driving records also bring to that. And again, if you're subcontracting to gig economy workers, do you have an oversight of what sort of driving history that person has? Should they be on the road, and should they be carrying those goods around as a preference to people who are held in-house and their history is known by the employer? So there are a couple of key issues, I think, that have come out of our recent research lately that I think need to be injected into this conversation and thought about, and the implications of the current decision-making on who's driving what, where and when for how much money need to be considered in this overlay. So that's my initial thoughts on the process that I've put together. think it might be time to hand over to Jerome and talk about his perspective from dealing with some of these operators now as well. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Stuart and Julie. Look, I must say, after hearing Julie's story, for those of you who don't know, I'm actually from the land, so I'm originally a farmer. I have no presentation. I thought I was just going to go a bit more of a discussion approach. And I'm from the farm, a large property over in WA, and Julie and I spoke quite extensively yesterday when we was going through this. And I guess it's always a bit of a bugbear when you hear, I guess, groups like that holding down and not treating drivers the right sort of way, because for those of you that understand agriculture, it is a crucial time, and you're under pressure to get the crops off, to get things away. And a simple thing my old man always taught us is if you want to get the job done quickly and reliably, you got to treat the people you work with really well, and that includes contractors, whoever it is. So we can load up a road train in about 15 minutes, and it'll be away from our farm, and off we'd go. So we never had a problem of getting good quality people. We looked after them and made sure that they were paid and went through that sort of system, because it's a crucial time in your crop, and you rely on them to service you and to backtrack to it all. But reading back through, and I spent a bit of time just reading through the Senate inquiry and Keeping Australia Moving, and just reflecting on the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal. And after hearing around Julie's sort of story as well, like, you reflect back, was that actually the right sort of structure that can tick those sort of boxes and to help those issues with poor payments and poor services, and holding the owner operators in place? If you go back and you look at that inquiry that went through, was there any actually surprises in the feedback that came through? Like I worked at the National Transport Commission, the Victorian Farmers prior to that. And a lot of the information, content, thoughts and issues raised still seem to be consistent over time in that sort of area. There are things improving, and I think it's quite insightful in that sort of area. But when you think about, I guess, where the power and the income and the money sort of lands, it still sits at the Commonwealth. It's up for them to distribute where it sort of goes out, and how do they use that distribution of power to influence and improve the road system that sits out there in the tiers of governments as well, to public report and make everyone sort of very aware of it. I guess from the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal and sort of digging up those sort of elements, will $100 make someone safer on the road when they're sort of moving it out there and getting the job on there? I think a bigger question is the structural elements, and making sure the person's paid, they're measured and picked up in those sort of areas moving forward. We're about to go through a massive transition and change with the gig sector sort of rising up, moving into this sort of area. But once again, I think there's a multiple levers you can use to influence safety when you go through a lot of these sort of elements. So have we been using them very effectively over time? Have we sort of been putting them out there and using them as powerful as possible as we can in this sort of country? And just the point that Stuart raised at the very end of his presentation around the age of the vehicles registration, where they're sort of sitting, national oversight history. One of the simple things, we've got a new heavy vehicle driver competency standard coming up, which will change how people become trained across the country, get a consistent level as you move through the tiers. But what about actually registration of vehicles in a national database, and having one process and picking that up, so wherever the trucks are operating, you don't have to change your registration between states, make life nice and easy for the drivers in that sort of sense. So you've got the NHVR number plate on the truck. Why can't you actually have it registered and controlled, so you can actually check on those things? Have you got a safe truck? What's the sort of history going in there? And it's not just the heavy vehicle sector that's facing this issue. You talk with a lot of these corporates sitting out there, and they want to have a duty of care for the drivers. They want to make sure that people are safe behind the wheels. They're creating KPIs for their workers when they're sort of driving. But how do you actually measure a KPI? How do you actually check up effortlessly for these drivers to make sure they are actually performing and driving safely? That's light, grey, heavy vehicle all the way through. Wouldn't an easy way be where you can actually see how they're sort of performing and picking that up as an easy sort of measure? For a lot of you probably become aware that I guess NRSPP was sort of been championing, and we've actually got Clocks A moving forward. We did a webinar just the other week with the Australasian College of Road Safety, which is fantastic. And I think that sort of shows, I guess, some of the levers available to you to be able to really influence safety and do things in the right sort of way. There's a number of case studies that Clocks A is going to be producing, and they're just waiting for approval. But I think some of the most powerful ones on that is some of those companies that signed up onto the Sydney Metro project and some of these major contracts. These are 5-6 year haulage working through the hearts of our cities. They started with an old truck, but under the specifications requirements for these major projects, they had to actually upgrade the trucks very quickly to remain on the contract. Otherwise, they're going to lose the opportunity for servicing it. They did sort of grind their teeth, but as a result, they picked it up. And that's probably got some of the newer trucks in the entire fleet operating on it because they had the reliability of the contract. But the other side of the coin was the contracts made sure so the trucks were turned around quickly on site. So once again, through the entire chain, back to Stuart's point on talking around the controls and how different groups can influence it, a lot of those trucks going through, they could have 2 to 3 minute turnarounds on site and they'll be away again. The main reason they did that is they knew where they were. There was no delay. There was no Heathrow effect where they had to circle through the city and wait to be going in. They weren't held up as they picked up moving through those sort of areas. And I think these are some of the ways, are there ways we can use the power of contracts and influences and recording of those areas? But back to Julie's point, if you can't get paid in a timely fashion, you can't pick them up, or their contracts will fall apart. So where's the recourse for drivers to step up and have those things dealt with in timely sort of fashion? And I think that's something where I think there's a lot of ability to influence and look after the owner operators. I look at the Clocks program over in the UK. One of the major strengths and why we sort of championed it for it is of the 100,000 drivers in it, about 52% of them are owner operators of 1 to 10 trucks. The reason being is because they can access contracts and markets in that sort of sense. As I mentioned, I've driven a heavy vehicle, truck and dog on the farm, done those sort of areas, and part of it was part of the ancillary sort of sector. Our trucks were very old, but once I guess we understood the business case for using newer contractors, and we used a couple of small companies to supply our farm. It's tax deductible, works out really well for the farmer in that sort of sense to do it. And we chose the trucks that were nice and reliable to go in that sort of sense. That being said, when I packed up and moved across the country to Victoria without any application requirement, I moved up a level in trucks of a heavy rigid to a heavy combination license. So I certainly haven't got the skills to drive that sort of area, but I went up when I moved across into Victoria. And whenever I did workshops with truck drivers, I like to use the point that whilst I may have that license, I certainly don't have the skills and would never try and drive those sort of trucks. Not that I even drive a truck and dog these days because I haven't got the skills in doing that anymore because I haven't done it for a long sort of time. One of the questions I guess that's been raised was around where the gig economy is going as well. We have got a working group at the moment, which has pulled together 6 of the major sort of organisations from that. We're creating a set of principles and bringing them together. We're focusing very much on the safety side of things. And what I've actually been quite impressed with, this are the ones that have come into the camp. What I found really impressive by a lot of them is actually, I guess, the safety management systems that they've got in place. Obviously, there are always going to be issues, but they have a lot of checks and balances and those sort of components around driver's licensing, the age of the vehicle, the registration, insurance, all those sort of components. Where there's a lot of duplication and crossover probably is a lot of them having mixed messages on the education and training, and that puts additional pressure on the drivers and ticking the boxes, and there's not the cross sharing across them. So that's the sort of the areas where we're sort of saying, is there opportunity to promote collaboration, sharing between these groups and raise the safety standard and engagement of the drivers? That being said, there's those who aren't part of the group I'm quite aware of, who we've tried to engage with and they have zero interest. They feature in some of the comments in the inquiry that took place as well. And I know, talking with some of my colleagues in some of the departments, they know pointedly that some of the vehicles they use are illegal and shouldn't be on the road. But the thing is if you're aware of these and these things are going on, but they're not enforced, this is the same sort of question that flows through when you read about the inquiry that's been taking place. If you've got chain responsibility, you've got these sort of levers in there and they're never being activated. Is that really an effective sort of form of regulation? The aim is to always have 2 parts. If you can use industry and levers and get them market to lead the way, I'm always all for that. But you also need to know that the other side of the coin is that you come through the heavy stick to push them along that sort of way as well. I just thought I'd throw some thoughts out there and some comments as well while I've gone and been drawing on and sort of going through the sort of area. So that's just some insights from me at the moment. happy to pass it back to you, Julie.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I actually have a question, and it's one that's very, very pertinent to this particular period of time. We've got a situation within the industry where there is incredible amounts of pressure being put on transport operators. It's a bit of a dirty secret, but the major retailers, mining, agriculture, etc., often their procurement teams and then the major transport companies, business development managers, salespeople, they're writing contracts that they actually don't intend to service. They write those contracts to satisfy their own performance bonuses and KPIs, and they intend to subcontract that work down the chain until it eventually gets to a company and a driver. So how then do we get them more responsible within the chain? Because at the moment, they seem to be escaping any accountability for their actions. Like, they're happily undercutting, but when they take their little cut off the top of that particular job, by the time it gets down to the eventual driver and the owner of the truck, there might not be enough money in that job to cover maintenance next month, to cover improvements in replacing of trucks. Like the actual example I gave very first up, that particular truck was a 1994 truck that I was driving in 2016.
Wow.
So that gives you an idea of where the industry is at the bottom end of the chain, where it's most heavily enforced. How do we get the top end of town at the table in the chain of responsibility?
Well, that's a big question, isn't that one? And that's where you could almost sit there and say maybe that is where the opportunity of the digitisation or could take place. I know that's happened in some of the grain trading sort of areas where you can use digital platforms now to sell your grain, and you take out the middlemen and you go straight to the coalface. So you can be a smaller operator in those sort of areas, and you can go cut straight through, and you haven't got these people taking the slices out of the marketplace, and you can use a digital platform for that. So maybe that is, and that could be the avenue of where some of the gig sector could flow through and do it in a positive sort of way. But it comes down to, I think, once again, if government was to legislate or come in, it's about creating, I guess, performance-based measures that say, well, these are the requirements for doing it, and putting it on the gig sector to say, well, okay, this is how we can come in and support, but this is how we're showing evidence that we're doing it in an open and transparent way. Because I guess the other conversation point we had yesterday, Julie, you spoke about, well, how do you know it's that person that's driving that truck that's got the right license to it and isn't checked it off? And I think that was a super powerful. That happens now, without a doubt. You jump in a taxi and you say, hang on, you don't look anything like the person that's supposed to be driving my taxi. How can you get some of these technology platforms that can use these sort of angles and do it the other way to give that confidence through the system that it's that driver that's in that vehicle, and you give the job to that person?
Stuart, any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess it begs the question on which angle you attack the problem from. Do you try to put in place processes within the contracting system that guarantees sort of minimum levels of payment and has an eye over what is actually being done, or do you try and attack it from the other direction, where you're much more prescriptive about operator competencies and vehicle standards for certain jobs? It's interesting to contemplate. Your NCAP have just announced a program of assessing heavy vehicle safety that they're contemplating, and in Europe, where they seem to have much tighter controls over heavy vehicle operation, they're even contemplating that this assessment might even have limitations on where trucks are able to drive. So if you don't meet the city safety requirements, you'll be banned from certain cities. And so the question is whether levers like that will work better, or whether it's better to try and extend the regulatory frameworks to make the organisations letting the subcontracts more accountable for those through extending the chain of responsibility. But I agree with Jerome, they're huge questions, and how you actually approach it is very difficult to understand. Doing nothing is probably not acceptable.
Yeah.
I like Rachel's point there that she's thrown in the chat as well. Like, can you go through and you put a minimum safety standard in as part of these sort of delivery requirements? But that then goes to, how do you guarantee it's that truck and that driver has those safety standards and meeting it? I mean, if you can use that lever, you go back to, once again, I'll use the clocks A, or you can even use the BHP, the faster NCAP, all these sort of ones. The retailers, they all dictate these are the requirements to move the vehicles, to services. So can you use some of those levers to set a minimum standard? And I think that is one of the real opportunities you can use in these sort of ways.
I guess it gets back to one of the problems that we have so little data about what current heavy vehicle operations are now. So you'd need to set up a much better monitoring system to see who's doing what, where, and that's actually accountable. The idea of using telematics much more widely in the heavy vehicle fleet, I think, appeals to me a lot, because it's no different to the Europeans have been using tachographs in their heavy vehicles for years. It can be audited at any point in time. So, and maybe it gets to the point that Anne Williamson has raised on the chat too, about maybe it's that accountability. So having people with their personal transponders that communicate with the truck, so we know who's driving what, when, where, and how, and for what purpose. And if we could start collecting that data, it would provide a mechanism for accountability of the system that we could then monitor through an auditing process. But none of that currently exists. So it's basically a free-for-all where no one actually really knows what's happening, apart from the sort of anecdotal stories that we've heard before.
Yeah. If I could be, there is coming in very soon smart OBM and TMA systems that will be going into the trucks. I think there's even a further extension of that could be used, because they're predominantly for the PBS vehicles that are over height, overweight, oversize, and need to run on permits. But that smart OBM system could also be used to calculate road user charges. It could also be used to provide road managers with the most excellent data on where trucks are, where they're operating, where the roads are likely to be damaged or are getting damaged, and damaged by what. And I think there's a great space for telematics.
And just on that, Julie, like over in the US under ATRI, American Trucking Research Institute, last time I spoke with them a couple of years back, they had over 750,000 trucks supplying them real-time telematics data. And what they have done is they've actually taken control, like feedback on supply chain flow, roads, improvements, congestion, things. It's taken out of the politicians' hands, and so said these are where the issues are. And so if someone says, oh, if a senator or someone jumps out and goes, oh, I guess you could use an example in Australia, we're going to chuck a car park in this suburb, they can actually go and say, we'll use tangible evidence, and they map it out. Is this a real supply chain issue? And what happens? And a number of times now, it's really been helping inform the infrastructure. I don't think they use the data anywhere near powerful enough from a safety perspective. A lot of it's used around congestion, but it's all ring-fenced and protected, can never be used for prosecution or enforcement. And I think that's how they built the trust over there. And I think that's the real opportunity, what Stuart was saying. If you can draw that information in, you can really help inform people. And one thing Anne always talks to as well is that fatigue side. It'd be fascinating to show the real world of fatigue on these sort of truck drivers going out there, and the issues of not having enough truck stops and safe areas to pull over, designing infrastructure around the regulations to support them.
So Anne and Rachel, I'm wondering if you might like to speak more to your question. Did you want to follow that further? We can unmute you. Rachel.
So we can't hear her.
Oh, we can't hear you. You're unmuted, but we can't hear you. So, Anne, while we're waiting, did you want to speak more to, because you've put a couple of questions, comments into, did you want to speak to them further?
I can if you want, but you might not be able to get me to shut up.
Oh, we will.
Okay. Look, sorry, I'm sitting in my car listening to this. Look, I think that we're playing around the edges here. The difficulty has always been that the industry, this is an industry that works on the really slimmest of margins. So some really obscene things happen, such as the things that happened to Julie, where both companies and drivers are left without payment, having to do way too many long hours, etc., etc. The RSRT, which I know this was supposed to be about, it was an attempt to establish the minimum payments for drivers as a way of trying to at least get some focus on trying to reduce the motivation for the industry to do excessively long hours, etc. And to take on jobs that within times that it can't be done. I mean, my issue has always been that the permissible hours of service for long distance truck drivers are way too long. It's not humanly possible to do what these drivers are asked and permitted to do. And we do, Stuart, we collect heaps of information about their hours of service. We have logbooks for Africa. Many of them are electronic now. There's heaps of information about it, but they're still permitting long hours of service, and drivers are still doing these really long hours of service because that's the way they're paid. And until we break that nexus, I think that all the other things like, dangerous, old vehicles, maintenance isn't done. I keep the old truck on the road. Drivers who really shouldn't be driving, and so on. These are at the heart. It's really the heart of the problem is the sort of gigness of the whole industry and the low remuneration in the industry.
Yeah, there's no cost recovery. I think that's the biggest thing. There's no cost recovery on a moment by moment basis. So, for instance, if you're doing Sydney to Melbourne, you're going to average around 200,000 kilometres a year in a semi trailer, and you're going to get about 2.2 kilometres to the litre of diesel. You're going to use around about 100,000 litres of diesel. Every cent that the fuel price changes is $1,000 you've got to find off your bottom line, and the rate doesn't change. There's no cost recovery. If there was a daily method of being able to calculate cost recovery, and there was full cost recovery within the industry, instead of trucks subsidising major companies, trucks actually making their way, would be a really novel idea if trucks were actually paid what they were worth. No one would ask anyone else to pay them half their salary.
Yep. That is what the RSRT tried to do.
Absolutely. And I think the RSRT was incredibly good. The only thing that I think let the RSRT down was that there were decisions made and there wasn't like the industry was separate to the decisions made. There wasn't that buy-in. There wasn't that ability to have that voice, to be able to be heard on what the industry, like the industry knows what it needs. If I'm driving a truck, I know how much fuel I'm going to need, how much wages I'm going to need, how much, we know. It's just a matter of how do we actually access the correct amount of money to keep those trucks on the road, pay for maintenance, pay our way, pay the road user charges, and do things safely.
And I accept, Anne, that there's a lot of data around, but what I think the problem is it's not collected consistently and it's not actually used, because if you start to generate an evidence base against practice, against outcomes, you'd actually start to have a rational conversation about how to address that. So do you have any thoughts on that space?
Yeah, unfortunately, I wish that were true. I think that the industry, there's a lot of vested interest in the industry to keep things as they are. and trying to get some change in the industry is exceedingly difficult. I mean, I regularly look at logbooks and electronic diaries, GPS. I mean, many of the companies keep regular and detailed information if they really wanted to do something about it, and they are attempting within the constraints that are currently allowed. Many companies do try and do the right thing, but as far as fatigue management goes, until we actually, recognise that 72 hours of work in a week or 84 hours of work in a week, much of it at night with only sleep during the day, is not your driver and the safety's best friend. People get tired, and this is not the way we need to be managing fatigue. Having technical devices in vehicles that tell the driver that they're tired is just telling them stuff they already know. They know they're tired, but where do you pull over if you've got a B-double or something bigger, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, I can go on and on, which I'll stop, I won't. But these are really difficult issues that we need some hard decisions and some concerted action to try and get around, because we do have a big problem in the industry.
Yeah, and I agree. Most of those companies know what's going on, but the fact that there's no mandate for them to report that and no access to that information to actually expose what the consequences are could be part of the problem here. Because if you rely on the industry to regulate itself through its own information, as you've just said, it's never effective because they have ulterior motives.
Yeah.
Arnold, Can we unmute Arnold? He's put a few comments into the chat box. And would you like to speak to it, Arnold?
Hello.
Hi, Arnold.
Yeah, sorry, my camera, I don't have a camera on my machine.
That's fine.
For security reasons. Certainly, in regard to the issues, I've been more involved with the drive suspensions on heavy vehicles, and in regard to accident statistics and records nationwide, it'd be great if they not simply record the make of the truck, but actually the make and model of these air suspension on the drive axles, because the details on drive axles numerically are not correct. All heavy vehicles, air suspension should be dynamic load sharing, not static load sharing. And if we upgrade them to dynamic load sharing air suspensions, we get 80% increase in the mean pressures in the air springs, and hence the or sway characteristics or the roll resistance of the air suspensions in service increases dramatically. And we are operating some of the highest loads and trucks in Australia with 4.6 metre, 2-deck cattle and 4-deck sheep cattle floats that they need the highest anti-sway or highest roll resistance characteristics you can get in service. These manufacturers can push out static roll characteristics of vehicles, but they're not giving the in-service characteristics, because a lot of vehicles, heavy vehicles, when they get to the top of a hill, they have no air in the air suspensions, and hence they have very minimal roll resistance. Should they rapidly accelerate post a hill upgrade downhill and then approach a corner, they have a subsequent rollover. The other issue is because of the adverse suspension details, air suspension details, drivers get high vibrations along route, because effectively you only have one axle at a time operating on multiple drive axle group. So if you have dynamic air load sharing, you greatly reduce the vibrations transmitted to the driver. And in driver fatigue, there's no consideration of the actual level of vibrations drivers are receiving from the actual vehicle due to the adverse suspension details. And in the current damaged road conditions from very heavy rain influxes, Advanced driver fatigue makes no account of the actual vibration levels the drivers are incurring en route, and hence how much rest and recuperation they should be receiving before they take on subsequent trips. The other issue I raised there is making trucks more complex. Automatic braking systems on front of truck. Well, if that breaks down because you hit a kangaroo driving along and you're running a fridge van or fridges and you have a full load of your fridge unit is fully loaded along route, and you hit a kangaroo and it takes out your sensor on your front bumper bar, do you stop the truck and not have it repaired while your load actually perishes and you get no payment for that load? And certainly I agree with the primary speaker that I have a truck as well, and I've been in private business as well, and people that don't pay at the end of the month should be, just the rug pulled from underneath them. 90 days before a driver gets paid, and yet he has to pay for his fuel at the Bowser. It's absolutely wrong. Right, thank you.
Thanks, Arnold. Any comments around that?
I think the points you raise, Arnold, are interesting, but I think it points to a broader problem in we actually don't have any good data on the heavy vehicle fleet. What we have is minimal. So understanding how some of those things that you've raised actually contribute to risk and outcomes is really difficult to ascertain. So I think that's another thing that actually needs to be integrated into the system. And a lot of our researchers identified this recently. There needs to be a lot better data on heavy vehicle specification, so we can follow that through the vehicle life.
I'm going to go back to Rachel now. She's got her headphones happening.
Yeah, is it working now?
Yeah.
Working perfectly.
Good to hear. Yeah, I've not really got the same level of special knowledge as other people in this group, but just in terms of gig economy, if the situation is bad now with payment and rates of pay and levels of safety, then it will get a whole lot better, if worse, I should say, if the gig economy platforms come into the picture. And it looks like they've already got into the picture a bit. So I just think that maybe for heavy vehicles, it's bad enough now without the majority being on gig economy platforms. And maybe we should be thinking about how you regulate to stop that from getting worse or becoming a bigger sector of the provision of truck movements and freight movements and construction truck movements. So I think that we know already from rider gig economy, driver gig economy, that whatever conditions people think they're going to have, it's much lower, the pay's lower. You're not going to get the same amount of, well, you don't really have any conditions because you're actually your own contractor. And it really did remind me some of the discussion that I used to be part of a while ago about supermarkets purchasing food from farmers and screwing down the prices. So you end up with this demand-led pricing instead of supply-led pricing. And it seems to me that maybe with freight and provision of haulage, it's demand-led pricing, which is a key issue. And if you end up in getting employed through gig platforms, it will just get a whole lot worse. So yeah, I'd be very concerned about things getting worse for drivers and their pay getting worse and their conditions getting worse and their labour being further exploited. So that's just my thoughts. Thanks,
Rachel. Any comments?
Yeah, I think they're fantastic points by Rachel. I knew she'd always raise really good ones in there, and I think on that, and that's where you think about the payment opportunities. If it's digitised the right way, like in the grain market, I know the way it sells is if someone's going to buy the grain, the money's got to be sitting in there already, so they're going to be able to demonstrate they can pay for the grain before it comes across. So same sort of thing. Maybe there's ways of using that before you can put someone's employment in you, and there's these minimum requirements if you're going to do this sort of way. The money's sitting in there so you can pay the driver. So it's sitting in the account, the job's done. Just because you think you pay for your trips and a lot of these other ones before it even kicks off, why couldn't it be the same sort of way? But then set those minimum requirements in there from a performance standard. And that empowers the driver, and all of a sudden the owner operators can go through and the circle. I think exactly your point, Rachel, you need those standards setting in there so it doesn't become a race to the bottom. Otherwise, we're going to finish even worse off. The other side is on that farmer reference with the market. You got to be sort of careful what you wish for as well, because I know some standards we're putting in the horticultural sector, and then all of a sudden they work around that and manipulate the farmer, put additional costs in a different way on it as well to try and spite them. So we've always got to be careful in thinking about what the unintended consequences can be from things as well.
Thank you. Glenn, I can see a chat for you. Would you like to unmute and speak to that?
Yeah, sorry, I'm in the office and there's a bit of background noise here normally. Yeah, I just the industry's crying out for change. We've been price takers for so long, and the industry has built itself around piecework. Where, you know, I was an owner driver myself for a long time, and I was faced with the choice of replacing my truck or getting out, and I got out because, you know, the pressure was on that. You know, breaking the fatigue laws and that is just daily occurrence for people who own a truck. You know, we still have people advertising for drivers to come work for us if you know how to get the job done, no matter what. You know, while drivers are piece workers, and most interstate truck drivers are gig workers because they get paid by the kilometre.
Yep.
If they don't do their job, they don't get paid. If you don't get to the end of your trip and get that load off, you don't get tomorrow's load. So you miss out on a whole day's pay or 2 days' pay, depending on how far you're going. You know, until we can actually remunerate transport companies and truck drivers and owner drivers for the time that they spend, not the distance they travel, I can't see us really improving anything. What do you guys think of that?
Any comments from anybody?
I was going to let Stuart go first.
I'm waiting on Stuart too.
I absolutely agree. I think it's problematic, and I think it really suggests that the regulation that should have been in place for minimum wages and cost recovery that's been talked about in this session really needs to be reconsidered again, because it's not fair for the contracting company to be making the money from the freight mover when the actual person doing the job ends up paying for it. So I think there's levers at every level that needs to be used, but I think there's got to be a space for regulation around and wages. So I think the fact that the recommendations have been almost ignored is absolutely problematic. But I guess it begs the question again, is how do you get the political class to actually move on this and actually do something about it? And I think, to me, that having the evidence of the consequences of that through safety outcomes, through mental health outcomes, other things that go with it, is absolutely critical to be able to then put it out into the public and say this is what this policy is doing in terms of its consequences in the community. And until we can generate that evidence from good data around it, I think we're going to struggle to make the point, because if you don't have good concrete evidence, everyone can always argue against the fact that a problem even exists, no matter how many people come forward to give their anecdotal stories. So, if you've got anything to add to that, Jerome?
I totally agree. I mean, each sector, you can't have a one-size-fits-all, like you're saying. We have minimum wages, but everyone's different. Every sort of sector is sort of different as well. So you need the nuances for that to reflect those vagaries and to look after the workers. Because I agree, I think you need to have that. And I like Ross Isles' work that he did here at Monash, when he sort of went into the pressure of the mental health and the psychosocial of truck drivers, showed the power of the investment and why it's sort of needed from that side. So we have a lot of the evidence sitting there. I think a tongue-in-cheek thing, I would love to see some of the politicians get out and have to spend a week in a truck and actually do a full fatigue trip and spend the time and actually have to stay awake the entire time next to the truck drivers and see it through their lens. I think if you can get them to begin seeing through the eyes and having empathy with this group, they might begin going, actually, these are an amazing group of people. They've got a frigging tough job that they've got to do. So how do we sort of protect them, and what do we need to do? Because I think you look at the profits of a lot of these companies that rely on their services, they're certainly not going down. So they seem to be squeezing those most vulnerable to make more.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Jerome. I think that there's definitely appetite within the industry for change. There's been a lot of moves this year in particular. It seems to be having a bit of a snowball effect. You know, I mean, there was a convoy on Canberra and most major cities in the last few weeks. There is an appetite within the industry for change, provided that the industry remains consulted so that those nuances that Jerome raised are addressed in individual sectors within the industry.
Yeah, it's almost a case where an active union would be really good for drivers, but we just seem to have lost all the unionisation power that we had for negotiating these things upwards. So I don't know what the answer to that is.
Yeah, the union's been working very, very hard, and a lot of organisations, even employer groups, are also very vocal within the industry, but there just doesn't seem to be a lot of reach outside of the industry. There's a lot of chatter within transport industry, but not a lot of reach to the general public as of yet. And that's a very, very good point that you make, that there does need to be that broader spread of information getting out amongst the public, particularly after the pandemic, when people suddenly realised, oh, gee, how do we get the things into the supermarket?
Even on that.
And that's where you imagine that industrial action in that space, led by a union, could be actually really effective, because it actually gets the population and the governing classes to realise how important this industry is to the functioning of the country.
Mm.
Yet it doesn't seem to have any leverage, which is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
I think one final comment in our chat from Chris Defar, and then we might need to wrap it up, Julie, because our lunchtime is nearly over. Chris, did you want to say anything?
Yeah,
to your comment?
Yeah, sure. I've just been sitting here listening. I'm actually from local government background, and some friends are heavily involved in the industry of farming, and they've had to undergo significant change because they did a lot of piece rate payments in farming, and I think it was last year or the year before there was a major change in that, and now there's a minimum wage applied as well. So change is possible, quite clearly, based on what's happened in farming. And maybe this is a model for you to have a look at, and how that change occurred, and how you could implement that change within the trucking industry.
Okay.
Well, all right. Well, I think we're at 13:01, and I think that's the bell. I'd like to really thank everyone for coming along and having a listen and participating. Stuart, Jerome, thank you very, very much. It was sad that Senator Sterle didn't make it, but we'll hopefully be able to follow up and hear something from him, even if I can get some pre-recorded message or something from him that we can tack on to the end of the recording when we send it out to everybody would be great. Thank you all so much. We do this every second month, and we're very keen to get any suggestions for topics that we might be able to cover off on next time.
And it's obviously one we could have kept talking about, but I think it's given us a lot of food for thought as well, and an opportunity to think a bit broader on the topic. So I'd also like to say thank you for being here. It was a good turnout for our very first lunchbox chat. So thank you, everyone.
Well
Thank you
done.
very much. You guys did an awesome job, and Julie, technology went perfect. You have nothing to stress about.
Ah, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks, everyone.